This is a 2001 Saab 9.3 Viggen, and it's the high-performance version of the early 2000s Saab 9.3, sort of the BMW M or Audi RS, except with a quirky Swedish twist. Today I'm going to review the 9.3 Viggen and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this 9.3 Viggen is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is, of course, your typical quirky Saab, but since it's a Viggen, it has more power and a manual transmission to add to the fun, and it's offered with no reserve. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 9.3 Viggen, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the 9.3 Viggen. And I'm going to start with a little overview. So, the Saab 9.3, it came out for the 1999 model year as an update on the Saab 900, which had come out in a new generation for 94. Now, the 9.3 from this era was offered with three different body styles. There was a two-door hatchback, there was a four-door hatchback, and then there was this, the convertible. Kind of a quirky range to offer your vehicles in, but it was Saab, and quirky was what they did best. Now, Saab offered this 9.3 with various different engine options, but the Viggen was the highest performance version you could get. Viggen is apparently the Swedish word for thunderbolt, and it meant power. In this case, it was a 2.3-liter turbocharged four-cylinder that made 230 horsepower. Now, by modern standards, that doesn't seem like all that much, but back in the early 2000s, late 90s, a high-pressure, high-performance turbocharged engine like this was pretty uncommon. There weren't too many vehicles that did turbocharging, and even among performance cars, getting that much power out of a relatively small engine was unusual. Plus, the 9.3 was pretty small. It's about the size of BMW 3 Series. That was the competition, and so 230 horses was a fairly healthy number, particularly when you considered that this car was front-wheel drive. And when you open up the hood and take a look at the engine, you can see it says Viggen right there on it as a reminder of just how special your particular Saab's engine is. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Viggen models didn't just get more power. They also had some other upgrades to help improve performance in other areas. For instance, an upgraded intercooler to help keep things cool under the hood. They also had a heavy-duty clutch, I guess to handle more clutch dumps when you wanted crazy acceleration, and suspension was upgraded for a firmer sport suspension that gave the car better handling. Saab also put other heavy-duty mechanical components on the Viggen models, like upgraded CV joints and drive shaft to make sure that this car had all the capabilities to handle all of its power. Now, beyond the performance, some other important Viggen items to know. For one thing, these were only sold with a manual transmission. You couldn't get the Viggen and an automatic. That would defeat the purpose of the performance and the fun-to-drive aspect. Also worth mentioning, the Viggen was sold in all three 9.3 body styles. So the convertible, the two-door, or the four-door hatchbacks, you could get them all, but strangely, the convertible was the most common. That's interesting. Despite being the high-performance model, you'd think the most popular one would be maybe the coupe, the two-door hatchback. Not the case, it was the convertible. As for production, apparently Saab only made about 4,600 9.3 Viggen models from 99 until they went away in 02. And of those, only about 2,900 came to the United States. So this car is surprisingly rare. And given the attrition that these have had, crashes, modifications, etc., there's probably not that many 9.3 Viggens left. As for what happened to the Viggen name, apparently it was dropped when the second generation Saab 9.3 came out for the 03 model year. Saab instead decided to start using the name Aero for its top-level performance trim, which was in line with other Saab models in the past. They had used Aero before, and they went back to it, and Viggen was dead. Although high-performance turbocharged Saab models certainly weren't, there were a lot of Aero versions that came later. Just Quirks, never another Viggen. But anyway, next up we move on to the quirks and features of the Viggen. Let's start on the outside with how you could distinguish the Viggen from the standard 9.3 models. One way was the larger wheels. The Viggen had distinctive bigger wheels compared to other 9.3s, and one thing I love, Saab was known for its 3-spoke wheels, but that design got a little weird by the early 2000s. People didn't like it. So this car has 3-spoke wheels with 3 additional spokes. Some might call that a 6-spoke wheel, but if you look at it, you can see what I mean. It's really 3 and 3 to be a callback to Saab's famed 3-spoke wheels. The other important way to tell a Viggen apart was this fender badge that was included on the front fender on both sides. Now, there was no rear or front badge on Viggen models to distinguish it, but you would look for that fender badge, and if you saw it, you knew that you were seeing the Thunderbolt with its 230 horsepower. I joke, but actually I remember as a kid when I would see a Saab 9.3 from this generation looking for that badge, and on the rare occasions when you did see it, you knew it was the cool one. And I still look at 9.3s from this era to look for that badge. Anyway, other interesting quirks on the outside of this car. For one, you have wipers for the headlights, as you can see, not just windshield wipers, but headlight wipers, which was somewhat common on Northern European cars in the 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s, and it's included here as well. And I also want to mention the model name, 9.3, was always kind of an interesting one, a little confusing, but here's what happened. Back in the day, in the 70s, Saab had a car called the 90, and eventually they came out with one called the 900, and then called the 9000. When it came time to replace the 9000, it was going to be a 9 with 5 zeros. So rather than call it the 90,000, they called it the 95. Which made sense. And because they had come out with that naming scheme for one car, they then called this the 9.3 because that's where it fit in the size lineup. Of course, it also made sense because 900 was a 3-digit number, and so it kind of fit with the naming scheme. Now, Saab went on to use this 9 whatever naming for a lot of other cars. The 92X was smaller than the 9.3, so that made sense. There was the 9.4 SUV and the 9.7, all with the number after the 9 being the relative position in the lineup. But that's how it got started, the 9000 becoming the 90,000, which they just wrote as 9.5. But anyway, next we climb inside the Viggen, and inside of a Saab is where the real quirks begin. You open up the door and you can see on the door sill it says Saab and also Viggen, as a reminder of the special performance car you're entering. Interestingly, there are no other reminders inside the car, just that door sill badge, which is covered up when you're driving. It doesn't say Viggen anywhere else in here. But you get inside, and the first thing you notice, well, you go to put the key in the ignition, and the ignition isn't there. That's because it's mounted in the center. This was a Saab hallmark touch. They did this on all of their vehicles, the center console mounted ignition switch. And apparently the thinking was if the ignition key was there, you got into an accident and you slid forward, your knee wouldn't impact the key and cause knee damage, which actually sounds like a pretty reasonable idea. And so that's why Saab relocated the key to the center. Other automakers had similar thoughts, and they did folding keys to help prevent this problem, and eventually even knee airbags. But this is what Saab did instead. Now, in this center console, you can also see a few other interesting and quirky items. You have your window switches here, the front window switches, and then behind them, the rear window switches, which are actually just the front window switches, but facing the other direction. So that's an unusual way to do it. Also, in this window switch area, you have this, which rolls down all 4 windows at once, side windows, front and rear, all at once, and you push it the other way and it rolls up all of these windows at once too, which is a fantastic feature. Great to have in a convertible if you want to go full top down or put the windows back up quickly. You don't have to do it individually, which is cool to see. Of course, in this area, you also have your roof control, your power convertible top, which is actually pretty simple to operate. When it's down, you just push it, well, up, and then the roof goes up. It takes a little bit of a while because some weird stuff happens with the rear deck, and I don't really know what's going on back there, but eventually the top gets to a position basically directly above the windshield, and then all you have to do manually is latch it in place, which is pretty easy. And of course, it's the same deal going the other direction. Just unlatch it first, and then you push the roof button and the car automatically does the rest. Although again, it's a bit of a slow process that involves the deck lid coming back and then the top folding down. It's not like modern cars that do it a lot quicker, but it still works and it still gives you the full top-down experience. Now next up, also in the center console, you would notice the gear selector. Of course, like I mentioned, a manual transmission, in this case a 5-speed manual. All of the Viggen models had manuals. There were no automatics. Now one interesting quirk of the gear selector situation, the car will beep if you open up the driver's door, even if the key isn't in the ignition, which is unusual. Basically, no car will do that unless the key's inside, then it beeps at you. But this one will beep anytime you open the door, unless you have the car in reverse. Apparently, to Saab, the best practice is to park with the car in reverse gear, and it will beep at you unless you do that because it thinks that you are doing it wrong. Apparently, not a whole lot of confidence in the parking brake, and they won't let you park it in first. You gotta be in reverse gear. Now, also interesting here in the center console, there is a cup holder, but it's all the way back, basically behind the front seat backrest. And to access it, you have to flip the center armrest back all the way back, so it's basically part of the back seat now, and only then do you have access to your cup holder, and even then it is only one cup holder. You don't get multiple, but hey, at least you have that. Also interesting here in the center console is this switch, which is kind of in no man's land in the middle of nowhere between the gear selector and the ignition switch. That controls the dome lights, believe it or not, and the control is unusual. The upper control turns on the dome lights. You can see it's a light that's on. The lower control turns off the dome lights, but it's a light that's still on, only partially. I'm not exactly sure why it doesn't show a light that's off, but that's exactly how they did that for whatever reason. And speaking of lights in this car, another interesting one is the night panel. This is another Saab hallmark feature. You can see the button for it is right here in the center control stick. It says night panel. And if you turn it on, what it does is turn off all of the interior lights except for the first half of the speedometer. And that way you can be in a completely dark nighttime driving experience. You don't have to have the glow of all your interior lights shining on you. You only see what is tremendously important, which is the early part of the speedometer with night panel on. Turn it off and all of the lights come back on, giving you the same typical glow of a normal interior like you'd expect. And by the way, on the subject of the speedometer, one interesting thing is how it's displayed. You can see it almost wraps all the way around and creates a full circle. Most car speedometers are sort of a half circle, starting at the bottom and then going all the way over to the other side. But here you almost have a full 360 speedometer. I guess this was so it was easier to see exactly what speed you were going, since it's spaced out a little bit more, but certainly a little unusual and quirky. Next up, we move back over to the center control stack, where you can see this display screen, which is sort of a precursor to modern infotainment systems that give you all sorts of vehicle information. Here, you get the basics. You can see like your driving range remaining, you can see your average fuel economy, average speed, how long you've been driving. All that stuff is in here, and you can switch between various different displays within this display screen to show whatever it is you want to see. Now, unusually, above this display screen, there's a giant light that comes on when the seat belts aren't fastened that says fasten belts. This is like the top center of the dashboard. One of the main focal points of the entire interior is this fasten belts sign that tells you to, well, fasten your belts. Kind of odd. And also kind of unusual in the center control stack is the climate vent situation. You can see one oval-shaped climate vent, but there's two little switches for you to move around the vent and position it where you want. That's because it's actually two vents. There's an upper vent and a lower vent. It's just contained in one oval-shaped housing. You have the same situation over on the driver's side, where it's actually pretty useful because you can aim the lower part of the vent like at your legs, and you can aim the upper part at your head or your body, which is neat to have two driver's climate vents that you can aim in two different directions. Next up, another interesting quirk in here, turning on the cruise control. It's not done with buttons on the steering wheel like most cars from this era, because this car has audio controls on the steering wheel, which is actually, frankly, more convenient and probably more frequently used. Instead, you turn on the cruise control on the turn signal stalk. You can see it here. There's a little switch that you can move between off, cancel, and resume, and probably the button at the end would set your speed, and that's your cruise controls on the turn signal stalk. Certainly unusual. And speaking of rather unusual controls, on the door panel you have only one real control, and that's the button to pop the trunk. You press that and the trunk pops open. You also have your power mirror control here, positioned right next to the mirrors, which is reasonably convenient and normal, but you're probably thinking, where are the locks, the power locks? And the answer is, you don't have a special button for it. If you want to lock the doors automatically, you lock one door and the other one automatically locks as well. Instead of a special center lock button, all you got to do is lock a door. They've simplified. Now, as for the rear seats in the 9.3 convertible, this car came from an era when back seats in a convertible were still a thing and could still be reasonably large. People would actually want to take people around in their convertible back seats. And so you can see here, they are decent size. There's only two of them, but they have fairly decent width and legroom, so people can actually sit back here, unlike in a Lexus LC or a Ferrari California, where the back seats are basically just a formality. Now, a couple of interesting things about these back seats. For one, you can fold them down. You see this little key slot. You can put the key in, twist it, and then fold the seats down if you want to expand the cargo space with the trunk. You also have a climate vent for the back seats, but just one single individual climate vent mounted right here in the middle. That was all you got for the backseat passengers, but it was better than nothing. And some could argue on a convertible it wasn't really all that important anyway, but you had it. That was luxury that Saab provided. And finally, we move on to the cargo area, the trunk of the 9.3, which, you lift up back here and it's actually surprisingly roomy despite the convertible top intruding into its space. You can see where the convertible top intrusion is, and it does come into the trunk reasonably much, but not as much as you might think. There's still a decent amount of trunk space back here under and in front of where the convertible top goes down. You will also notice that back here you have a separate light that you can turn on in order to illuminate the trunk, so you can root around and find exactly what you're looking for. There's also a switch where you can turn the light off if you've decided you do not want to see what's in the trunk. You just want it to be dark to make it harder to get in and find things. One other nice convenience feature on the inside of the trunk lid, you can see there's this little plastic piece here with an orange tab. That is the handle that you can use to close the trunk. You just put your hand in, pull it down, and it closes, and then you're off driving your Viggen, which actually I'll do right now. All right, driving the 9.3 Viggen. Now, this may surprise some of you, but I've actually wanted to film a video review of a 9.3 Viggen for a long time. I think this is a cool car, and I remember when I was a kid and it came out thinking that it was a really cool car, and I've always still had that thought. I would prefer to shoot a blue coupe, which was the two-door hatchback, but they're just so hard to find, and I've decided, at some point I'm going to stop holding out on waiting for the perfect 9.3 Viggen, because I'm not even really sure that it exists anymore. So many of these cars died by attrition that this one showed up on Cars and Bids, and I was like, I'm just gonna do it. It's local, and I want to check out this engine and this quirky, weird car. And it's not blue, the coolest color, and it's not a coupe, which was like the cool body style, but it's still a 9.3 Viggen, and I still want to shoot it, and so I'm thrilled that I am, even though it's kind of a ridiculous car that's not really all that valuable. So first thing I noticed driving around in this car, the shifter clutch action is actually pretty good. I'm surprised. The clutch is nice and linear, very easy to push down and come back. There's no weird kink to it, not too heavy, it feels great. And the shifter also, you put it in gear and it's got a nice little notch into gear. It's not it's not vague, it's not rubbery. It does have a little bit more play in gear than I would want, but honestly, the whole shifter clutch setup feels like a sports car. It feels like good and well thought out beyond just like we had to do this and so we did. The next thing I noticed pretty much right away is there is a decent amount of cowl shake. You could probably see the camera shaking, meaning that there's not an enormous amount of structural rigidity holding everything together. The coupe obviously would have had that, but the convertible, because it doesn't have a roof, I mean, convertibles up until only a few years ago were kind of rigidity problems in general, and this car falls into that category despite being like the high performance Saab, basically. So let's talk performance. This powertrain is reasonably powerful, and it is surprisingly smooth, which I think is a pretty nice feature of it. Ooh, I put my foot down and it goes. Damn, I'm shocked by that. That was not what I was expecting would happen. I thought it would be a little bit lazy and get up and go, but it is not. Given the power number, like 250 horsepower, I was not expecting it to be quite this quick, but it is in fact quite this quick, and surprisingly not as laggy as I was expecting that it would be. Okay, there is a little lag when you first start going at low RPMs. It needs some time to build into that 2,000 to 4,000 RPM range, but when you get up there, it really starts to move a shocking amount. Now, one of the big complaints about this car in period was that it had a problem with torque steer. Because it was a lot of power going to the front wheel drive, it would steer off, and boy, that is definitely true. If you're starting from an absolute dead stop and you floor it, you're gonna get some wheel pull over to the right. Surprisingly not wheel hop, but just torque steer off to the right. So you have to kind of keep an eye on that if you're really, really going at it from a dead stop. If you do it from kind of the mid-range, it's muted, it's not as bad, although it is still kind of there. But you do have a torque steer issue. I mean, this was the Wild West of turbocharging cars. You know, in the 80s, the 90s, even into the early 2000s, there were a lot of turboed cars, but it wasn't the mainstream, and people didn't really expect anything from it. Like, if you were getting a turboed car, you were generally buying a performance car, and so you were willing to kind of put up with some weirdness like this. It's a fairly nice interior, and despite the fact that this is a 20-plus-year-old car and it's a Swedish bazaar, the materials have all aged okay. There's some cheap plastic, of course, but nothing's really rattling, nothing really sounds too bad, nothing really looks that bad despite the age. It's all a pretty good job of, I don't know, seeming okay. I mean, it's a luxury car. All right, I'm gonna give it some gas here. Let's see what happens. Yeah, nothing. Woo! Explosion. The old days of turbocharging. It was a different time. Honestly, I'm actually surprised by this car in general. It's really not so bad. It's kind of nice. It drives reasonably well. It's smooth. I think your issues are always going to be like lack of support. I mean, Saab parts still around. You can still find them, but I think that will dog this car as it starts to get older. And, you know, it's a big, powerful front-wheel drive car, and that's kind of the issue. It's never going to play in the league of the BMW M cars, the Mercedes AMGs, but I find this car to be better than I was expecting. More charming, fun with the roof down, and, you know, obviously you don't have to be flooring it to enjoy a roof down car. It's still a nice drive with a good manual transmission, but when you do floor it, you do get rewarded with a surprisingly decent amount of power. This car's not so bad. I can see why they were desirable back in the day. And it's kind of cool to check out and to drive. And so that's the 2001 Saab 9.3 Viggen, the high-performance version of the Saab 9.3, Saab's version of BMW M. It may not be as thrilling or exciting as a BMW M car, but it is pretty cool to check out and very interesting in its Swedish way. And you can buy this 9.3 Viggen on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Saab a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 43 out of 100, which puts the Saab 9.3 Viggen convertible here against some sort of similar cars. Truthfully, though, this isn't a fair fight because the Viggen is less of a high-performance car than vehicles like the Audi TT, the 350Z, the Pontiac Solstice GXP, and it's less of a luxury car than the SL500 or the Jaguar XK8. It's really just a mid-luxury 4-seat convertible with some add-ons that make it exciting, plus some weird Swedish quirks that increase the fun. I like this car. It drives better than I expected, and it's a decent value for the money.